Honey, bonjour, sego, kwe, watcha. Allan Mountford here again with video number 3 in a series of videos for the Anishinaabe G7 online conference for 2020. Again, thank you all for being here and for listening. As I said in the other 2 videos, this is a pretty strange way of delivering information. We're used to being with people, we're used to interacting face-to-face and personally, so this is a fair bit of a challenge, and I ask you to bear with me because I'm just not used to talking into a camera. So the third video here is not going to be a terribly long one because, to be honest with you, a lot of the decisions that you have to make have already been made. I want to talk about COVID-19 and the effect of returning to school that COVID-19 is having. And there are 2 directions we're going to take a look at here. One is in terms of the provincial schools and the expectations and what you can see happening with the provincial schools. And the second, I want to talk a bit about the reserve schools. So you will have a choice of whether you want your children to return back to school, or you may not have a choice depending on the jurisdiction. And if you do have a choice, it's one of 3 things: whether to go back full time, whether to go back part time with distance learning or online learning for part of the time, and then the third is full distance learning. And to be honest with you, I think this is going to be aired on September 10th. You probably just under a month ago had to make the decision. If your child goes to a provincial school, you've already made that decision as to whether or not they're going to return and what that's going to look like. However, that's not set in stone. You do have an option at the end of the school term to reverse that decision. So you can keep that in mind, that if things don't work out, you do have a chance to remedy that. So let's talk about those provincial schools first and the decisions that you're making. And in terms of the provincial schools, there are several risk factors that you have to look at. And with kids with FASD, this is very important because of all the health implications of our children. So I guess the number 1 priority is to take a look at your child's conditions, health conditions. And then secondly, you've got to take a look at the health conditions of the family and close contacts. Do you have elders in your household? Children can carry COVID and have absolutely no symptoms whatsoever, which could affect elders in your household. You also have to consider your family's ability to find childcare. You have to take a look at your child's developmental needs and decide if keeping them home is going to sacrifice having some sort of extra help in the schools. Now, that being said, we talked in the second video about the fact that a lot of the education systems don't really have FASD as a priority, and quite often the specialized help that kids with FASD are getting comes because the parents have demanded it themselves. It wasn't generated and initiated by the schools. So that will be a very situational thing depending on where you are and depending on the experts in your school system. It may be better for your child to attend school, or it may be better for your child to not attend school and get the extra attention that they need at home. And then, of course, there's the decision to be based on how you can homeschool. Do you have the capacity to homeschool? Do you understand the curriculum? Do you understand the approaches and the accommodations needed, especially for children with FASD? So there's a lot to consider there. And as I say, this is maybe a moot point anyway, because if you're in the provincial schools, you'll have made the decision, or not. As I say, I'm going to talk in a minute, geographically, some of the schools have different expectations in the north of the province than some in the south of the province. But in terms of heading back to school, what the experts are looking for is it's what they call the 3 C's: closed spaces, crowded places, and physical contact. And they want to avoid each of those. And the irony there is that that pretty much describes every school in the country. Kids are together, they play together, they move around together. So sometimes it's what I call like herding cats. to try to keep especially young kids apart is next to impossible. We do have some history here, some short history in terms of back to school from some other countries. And we know, for instance, in Israel, it did not go well. They did not make a priority for physical spacing. They didn't make a priority of small class sizes. They didn't mandate the wearing of masks, and they didn't look after ventilation problems. And unfortunately, they had a heat wave, which caused a big spike in the COVID-19 presence in the school system, especially some high schools got particularly hit. Yet on the other side of the coin, we have Finland and Denmark, who sent their kids back to school full time into the classroom. So in terms of the provincial schools inviting the children back into the school system, 5 priorities. One priority was, bottom line, was to keep COVID out of the schools. It's known, well known, and especially Finland and Denmark showed this, that if you do not have COVID-19 in the population, then it's not going to be in the schools. So they're looking at prevention versus control, preventing COVID-19, and then no problem with the schools. Second priority is frequent checks for symptoms. And if you don't know what the symptoms are, make sure you get to your health unit, your local health unit or health department, because believe me, the symptoms will be posted. Check yourself and check your kids before they leave each day. And this whole notion that kids have to go to school, and that's certainly the mantra that I had growing up, that you have to go to school and you've got to get your education. Not with COVID-19. If your kids are feeling sick, then you know what, keep them home. Or if they're showing any of the symptoms, keep them home. And that being said, we know that people can carry the symptoms for 2 weeks and not show anything at all, and infect other people. So that's why the third priority of staying apart is so important in the schools. So they are, so they're calling it physical distancing, and what they're doing in the schools is, in some schools they are, in the high schools, some high schools, they are doing part-time, 15 kids in one day, and then home for distance education the next day, different set of 15 kids who did their distance learning the day before. So that way they're able to do it. In terms of the elementary schools, they're looking at putting the students into what are called cohorts, and they are monitoring the movement throughout the school based on those cohorts. Priority number 4 is ventilation, having proper ventilation. And unfortunately, the design of most modern schools is such that the airflow is contained within the environment of the facility. That does not make for healthy COVID-19 environments. We need to be able to open the windows. We need to be able to open the doors so that the air can refresh. Then priority number 5 is for the teachers and the students to have the personal protective equipment. It's what they've been calling the PPE. They need to have masks. They need to have, if masks aren't appropriate, then they need to have the face shields. And again, this is really a challenge because, especially with the younger kids, when you get toddlers and infants, and preschoolers, these kids don't know anything about physical distancing. That's not what they're all about. They're and in terms of supervising them, we know that these kids need physical contact. They need hugs. They need to be looked after in a physical way quite often. So that's going to be a huge challenge. What we do know is that the health professionals are telling us that for students going to school, having to wear masks, take 2 masks or 3 masks for the day, one for the morning and one for the afternoon, or one in case it gets soiled. Many of our kids with FASD need to be able to see your entire face, and I don't know how this is going to work out. Nobody knows how this is going to work out. We know that kids with FASD often have sensory integration difficulties, and I'll tell you, when you've got a mask on and it's a little more challenging to breathe, I'm not sure what the reaction of kids with FASD is going to be. I suspect we're going to see some behavior around that. So maybe the answer is for kids with FASD to have the face shields. Then it's more like a hat sitting on top of the head with a protective shield. And they can also then see the nonverbal cueing. They can see the facial expressions of people talking to them. And for kids with FASD, that's important. They have limited communication abilities anyway, so to take away something that's very personal in terms of looking at another person's face, that could be very challenging for kids with FASD. So the schools, the provincial schools, pretty much coast to coast, have agreed that we need physical distancing, we need additional cleaning and hygiene models, we need class groupings, as they say in Ontario, we're calling them cohorts, and then there has to be daily screening of the health of the kids going to school. So in Ontario, we have full-time classrooms from kindergarten to grade 8. We have cohorts and groupings. We have daily screening, and we have mandatory masks for all grades. Now, this whole COVID thing is so fluid. It's changing day to day. This video is being made August 20th, and just literally things changed yesterday within hours. Masks were not mandatory after or up until grade 4. And then all of a sudden masks are mandatory for every student. So we're seeing changes daily. So as I said, by the time you see this, things may have even changed further. So we know that in the elementary schools, the kids going to the provincial schools will go 5 days a week, split into cohorts, which means that they will be able to take groups of students and physically separate them. Recesses, lunches, bathroom breaks will all be staggered to support the cohorts. High school students, however, will go back depending on their geography. So the ministry has designated certain boards, and most of those, quote, designated boards are in southern and central Ontario. The northern schools are going by a different criterion, and that's because they're taking a look at student populations. So where the populations are higher, what they're saying is that they will go back with alternating days and with cohorts of about 15 in the classroom, and then with distance learning for the other time. The elementary schools, however, will go back as usual 5 days a week, but again with cohorts and with movement around the school based on those cohorts. Now, parents will be able to keep their kids out of class, and you will know this now. And I think between now and when you get to see this video, there will be some determinations around whether the schools actually do start on September 8th or whether there's going to be a staggered start. You can make a choice to have your kids learn virtually. In terms of clubs and organized sports, they are only going to be allowed if there's if physical distancing is possible, and if the spaces are disinfected between use. So in terms of physical education, let's say, in an elementary school, you have a 40-minute period. It's going to take the kids at least 15 minutes to wash their hands, get themselves ready and physically distanced to do the activity. And then at the end, the same thing. You've got to have physical distancing. You've got to have take the time to wash the hands and get back to class. So there's another 15 minutes, so that leaves about 10 minutes of instructional time. So as I said, it's a fluid situation, and we will see what reality really brings about when the kids go back. So those are your provincial schools. Different situation possibly for the reserve schools. So the Reopening Ontario legislation, Reopening Ontario Act of 2020, Ontario Regulation 364/20, says that all the kids that all the kids have to maintain the physical space. It talks about the cohorts. It talks about the number of kids, capping the number of kids in a specific area. And it even gets very specific around music programs. If they're singing, there has to be a plexiglass or some impermeable membrane between the kids who are singing. So they get pretty prescriptive. However, it also says that a school operated by a band, a council, or the Crown in the right of Canada, or operated by an education authority of a band or a council, or thirdly, an entity that participates in the Anishinaabe education system, are exempt from the regulation. And the reason for that is pretty simple. It has to do with governmental jurisdiction. In Ontario, education is a jurisdiction of the provinces. The reserve schools, the Anishinaabe schools, the Indigenous schools are under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So let's take a look at those schools and what's happening with them. In many cases, the reserve schools follow the example of the local provincial schools. However, they don't have the same funding as the provincial schools. And in taking a look at articles and in talking to a couple of leaders, what I found is that the communities are scrambling to deal with COVID-19 in the schools at this point because of lack of funding. Some of the schools, for instance, in the Southwest region, they're saying that, as a specific example, Antler River School would need to triple its space to accommodate the cohort, the social distancing requirements. How do you do that? How do you all of a sudden increase your capacity? So I spoke with Chief Dean Sayers from Batchewana, and I said, what are you guys doing? What's happening up there? And what Dean indicated was that in terms of that physical spacing, they're now going to take a look at using more of the community, looking at some of the community centers, looking at places where kids can go to separate from that. Now, in terms of Indigenous funding, the federal government says that they provided $685 million to address COVID in the Indigenous communities. And it was not limited to, but could be used for support for the elders and vulnerable community members, could be used for food insecurity, could be used for mental health assistance and an emergency response, and could be used for the schools. So what Dean said that, or Chief Sayers said that they are doing in Batchewana is they are going to have within these learning centers or these learning pods, they're going to have extra EAs. They've also allocated an increase in funding for back to school necessities. You see, kids won't be able to share stuff. They won't be able to share colored pencils or pens or rulers or whatever, so they're going to need their own. So they've increased their funding, I believe, from $30 to $100 for the elementary school kids going back. And for the secondary kids, again, funding increase to $100 for back to school, and that's per semester, so that they can get what they need. So it seems to me that in the Aboriginal communities, in the Aboriginal schools, we really have an advantage because we have a millennia of experience in teaching kids a different way. The provincial schools teach in a very linear way, going from kindergarten to grade 12. In terms of the curriculum, it's learning these particular things before you can move on to the next. Whereas with the Aboriginal and Indigenous populations, our traditions have been more of a cluster learning situation, where the children learn at the gatherings. They learn being with the elders. They learn being with the traditional teachers. And I'm suggesting here that this may be just the time to take the kids out of school, get them outdoors where there's lots of ventilation, and let's get those traditional teachers, granted physical distancing, but let's get them talking to the kids. Let's get them delivering curriculum as best that they can, and get back to that whole idea of cluster learning as opposed to the provincial one. And of course, for kids with FASD, this is awesome because it may take away a lot of the sensory integration challenges around schools, around being cooped in with a bunch of other kids, and with the fluorescent lights and with the noise and whatever. Why not get them out into nature? Allows for more culturally appropriate accommodations. You can deliver the Ontario curriculum in so many creative ways, and I see this when I go into some of the reserve schools where the teachers have taken the regular curriculum and they've adapted it using culturally appropriate accommodations. Less cleaning to do, obviously, if they're outdoors, and as I say, the distancing is much easier to do when you're not in a confined space. And we have all sorts of research that tells us that being in nature is good for us. I mean, it's good for us in terms of our health, physically and mentally. So in making your decision, now, as I say, you've made your decision. If your children are in a provincial school, you've probably already made your decision. However, you can, at the end of the school term, you can change that. Just want to address the difference between homeschooling and remote learning and how they are different. If you've got a child that is remote learning, they have the option to attend a regular school. While they are doing the remote learning, they are registered with the provincial school. It is up to the provincial school to provide the curriculum and to provide the assessment for those students. Whereas if you do homeschooling, your child is not registered with the school. You do not, frankly, even have to justify to the ministry or to the board what it is that you're doing. As long as you're comfortable delivering the curriculum, then you can do so, and with the understanding that you're doing it on your own, and the board has absolutely no responsibility whatsoever for your child. However, some boards will give you all sorts of homeschooling resources, and to be honest with you, there's a lot of parents out there, especially parents and grandparents of children with FASD, that are homeschooling for a myriad of reasons, and all you have to do is Google that and you'll be able to find out how they're doing it. There are tons of resources. There are all sorts of self-help groups especially for kids with FASD in homeschooling. So take a look at those resources as well. Remember, one of the priorities that I said a little earlier is that you have to assess your ability, your capacity to provide homeschooling. So take a look, and maybe that's the option that you want to go. If you do decide to homeschool, however, and the school board feels that maybe you don't have the capacity and you're just trying to avoid sending your child to school, you can be audited. They can investigate they feel that you're pulling your child just because you don't like a particular school or a particular teacher, you have to be able to justify what you're doing. So you need to make a plan, a homeschooling plan. Do you need to submit it to anybody? Absolutely not. It's your plan. But if the school does challenge why you're homeschooling your child, then it would certainly be best to have that plan. The second entity that can investigate is the CAS or Child Protective Services, if they feel that because education is mandatory in Ontario, if you are not providing that education, it can be seen that you're not providing one of the basic duties for your children. So thanks very, very much. I appreciate you listening to this, as I say, especially when, who knows, we've already started the COVID-19 back to school thing, and we'll find out exactly how that goes. I would like to ask that if you need any information from me, that you can get a hold of me, and I'm going to hold up the information sheet. This is how you can get a hold of me. There we go. And I would be pleased to answer any questions that you have, or if you want me to come and visit your community, then we can do that as well. So thank you, and hopefully we'll see you sometime real soon. And next year, I hope our conference can be back in the regular circle. So Chimigwech, Blama P.